But you'd like one, do just put your hand up and Liz can bring one to you. When you have a church Bible, please turn to page 1013, 1013. That will take you back to James chapter 5. And we're continuing our series that we've been going over on the family of God, on the one another sayings. There's translation available. If you'd like it, do just scan that, and that will help you follow along. But we've looked at different other sayings, but the one we're looking at today is do not grumble against one another. You find that there in chapter 9 of our passage. Do not grumble against one another. And behind that kind of idea is don't strike out with your words. Don't lash out with your words against one another. Don't even lash out and strike out against one another in the church family within your heart. So there is a special context to this command, this call not to grumble against one another. And the context really is the pressure that we can feel from persecution and from the suffering of persecution, which we will look at in a moment, which you find in verses 1 through 6. So injustice and persecution can cause pressure to build in a person's life. And when pressure builds in a person's life, then we can lash out and we can strike out, even against those people round about us. We can grumble against people. So it's a bit like a football team, you know, they might be winning at half time and they're in total harmony. It's a great atmosphere in the change rooms at half time. They're 2-0 up. And then halfway through the second half, they're 4-2 down. And suddenly they're feeling the pressure and they're getting at each other and they're lashing out at each other. And of course the opposition, they love that, don't they? So they try to wind them up and they play dirty and they give them a foul and they fake an injury and all that. And it provides more and more pressure. Well, this happens in football, but James is saying, beware of it happening in the church. We will come under pressure from all sorts of situations, not just injustice and persecution, but whatever the source of our pressure, we are not to strike out against each other. We are not to grumble against one another. When we do that, Satan, our opposition, he loves it. He wants to see it. He hates the family of God. You know that, right? He hates unity in Christ. And he wants to see us divided. And he wants to cause division. And he hopes that by applying his pressure, he might get the whole church grumbling. So we are not to grumble, but we are to groan. So you're not to grumble, but you are to groan. You see, in that word in verse 9 there, do not grumble, it also is the word used for groaning and to groan. And Paul the Apostle, in his letter to the Romans in chapter 8, he picks up this idea of properly grumbling or properly groaning. So let's see what he says over in, there we go, Romans chapter 8. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up until the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, we who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan. So we've seen the word twice there, that word for grumbling. Groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with wordless groans. So the Spirit enables us to groan. So we are to grumble, but it's to be to God, not against each other. We are to groan towards him. Groaning to God is our pressure release valve. And so you see the title of our sermon this morning. Don't grumble, but do groan. How are we to be helped so that we don't grumble against one another? Well, that's one question. We also have the question, why was this a danger for the people that James was writing to? So let's answer both those questions of how can we be helped, but why was it a danger? And we'll start with the second one. Why is this a danger for grumbling for these Christians? And we've already begun to think about the answer. They were suffering injustice. Real deep suffering. And we get a picture of it in those opening verses 1 through 6. And James begins chapter 5 a bit like an Old Testament prophet, full of vivid language against those who are persecuting the church and those who are unrighteous. So he denounces their excessive wealth, because they are the rich in society that are doing that in this case. And he denounces how they are stockpiling and building up their wealth. Look at verse 3. He says, you have laid up treasures in the last days. That's what they've been doing. And these people are living like there is no coming judgment, as if success in life is judged by how many possessions you die with. But judgment is coming. Everything they own will become nothing. That's what James is warning these people about. And not only are they filling their lives with wealth, but they are seeking to satisfy every desire that they have. Verse 5, it says, you have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. And then look at the graphic illustration he gives. He says in verse 5, you have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. That's a very graphic picture. And James is saying here that just as animals would be fattened up for the coming feast by people, and therefore their slaughter, so these rich people are fattening themselves up. They're making themselves ripe for God's judgment. And just as those animals that were fattened up were ignorant of that day of slaughter that was just ahead of them, so these people are. They're ignorant of the day of judgment that awaits them, the divine judgment, when God rights all wrongs, when justice is finally and fully done, when each one of them is called to give an account of their life before the holy God. And these people, while they are indulging themselves with greater wealth, they are also exploiting the poor and the weak. Verse 4, you see that. Look, behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud. You cheated them. That's what you've been doing. And they haven't only been cheating the poor and the weak, they have been persecuting the righteous. Verse 6, you have condemned and murdered the righteous person. And of course, this is the link between these persecutors and the church, because the church are included in that group of righteous people. They are truly suffering at the hands of these people. How does the church respond to this type of suffering? How do we respond when we suffer injustice? When we suffer deep pain and sorrow? When we cry out, Lord, bring it to an end? Or we cry out, Lord, it's unjust and it's unfair. Or maybe we go even further and we say, Lord, you're unfair, because we struggle to separate God's sovereign control from what is happening and what these people are doing. How can and should the church respond to such injustice? Well, of course, there are legal means in a country like ours. There are legal means where there is genuine injustice, and a Christian is free to use those. But that's not the case in every country by any means. And so we suddenly see that there's a different approach for the church. We are not to grumble, not against our brothers and sisters, but even not against those that are persecuting us. We're not to lash out. We're not to seek revenge upon them and begin to behave like they behave towards them. And there is a kind of twisted warning here as well from James, because it in a twisted kind of way, when people are persecuted and they suffer injustice, sometimes they can then do it to other people. And sadly, this is what is happening in the church. Look back at chapter 2. At the start of chapter 2, in the opening verses, we see that there is favoritism in the church. And they are showing favoritism to the rich over the poor. And so in verse 6, James says to them in chapter 2 of verse 6, he says, "But you have dishonored the poor person. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you were called? How are you behaving like them? You're suffering at their hands, but then you're also behaving like them. How dangerous the pressure of injustice can be." So the picture put before us here in these verses in James is of a church experiencing injustice from the worldly rich, and there is pressure there. But some in the church are behaving like the worldly rich, and they are causing more pressure in the church. And James teaches the church, don't lash out, don't grumble against your innocent brothers or sisters because of injustice. Don't lash out against your persecuting brothers or sisters. Now that doesn't mean you don't deal with issues. There is a righteous way and there is correction that can happen in the church, but that's different from grumbling and lashing out. And that's what James is saying. Don't let these pressures do that to you. So where are you feeling pressure in your life right now? Are you feeling pressure? Maybe life is wonderfully good and there's no pressure. But I would be surprised if some here aren't feeling pressure. Where are you feeling it? What are the situations that cause you to grumble against others? To lash out, maybe even silently in your heart? What you're experiencing may not be the injustice exactly that James is outlining here. But you may be saying, God, it's unfair. It's not right. God, I can't take this much longer. And people around you may be feeling the heat of the pressure you feel. You may be able to think where you've lashed out under pressure. So we've considered for a few moments why James is writing to these Christians about the danger of grumbling. Now let's think about how James seeks to help them so they won't grumble against each other. And the first thing that he gives them is he tells them to fix their eyes on God's vindication. They must do that. God's vindication, that's the time when things are proved true. When things are proved right. When you and I, as Christians under suffering, we might be proved true. But it's also a time when there is clarification. Where things become clear, where what was confusing, where you were crying out saying, why, when it's answered by God. In other words, maybe when God vindicates himself in your life and you see why. And James says, fix your eyes on that day of God's vindication. We see that, don't we, in verse 7 of our passage. He says, be patient therefore, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. There is the day that we are all to fix our eyes on. And he repeats himself in verse 8. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Fix your eyes on that day. Verse 9. He says at the end, look, behold, the judge is standing at the door. The day of vindication. Jesus is saying, he's pointing them to the return of Jesus Christ, and he is saying, have it firmly fixed in your sights. Why is this day important? Well, in this context, it is the day when all injustice is dealt with. The day when the judge returns. No injustice will escape the judge. And what vindication there will be on that day for the suffering church. For those who endure, for those who wait. And suddenly the sorrow and the suffering and the persecution will, can I say it, become worth it. Wow. On that day, such will be the glory of that day. whatever has gone before will be worth it. But also on this day, all confusion will be cleared up. Every Christian who has been crying out, "Why, Lord?" will be satisfied. They will be answered. What a day for the church and each believer to set before them. What a final destination to fix your eyes on. What a pressure release it is to set your eye on that day and to say, "Lord, I will commit the injustices to you. I won't lash out. I will trust you." And the pressure goes as you firmly have that day of reckoning before you, and you commit your injustices to that day. Now, fixing our eyes on that day of vindication provides us with a framework for the rest of our lives. So let's think about that framework. God recognizing God's sovereign framework in our life. And we see this framework put before us in the illustration of the farmer in verse 7. So he says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord." And here is the illustration. Here is the example of the farmer. "See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains." So this farmer is our example. How he waits is how we are to wait. And how does he wait? Well, we see he fixes his eyes on that final day, doesn't he? On that day of harvest. The day of harvest is called the day of precious fruit for the farmer. And he sets his eyes on that day. He trusts God, the God of the harvest, for that day ahead and what he will bring about. And the farmer setting his eyes on that day brings patience into his life. Do you see that? It says that in verse 7 that he is being patient about it. So because he's got this marker ahead, it brings patience for whatever then happens in his life. Patient, long-suffering marks his life. And James is saying this same patience and long-suffering should mark our life as we wait for that day. And that's why at the start of verse 7 it says, "Be patient, be patient." And at the end of the illustration, at the start of verse 8, it says, "You also be patient." He bookmarks the whole illustration with this point. We need to be patient and long-suffering. So the farmer is our example. He has his eyes fixed on the day of vindication and he patiently waits for it without grumbling. But he also accepts humbly the path God sovereignly calls him to walk. And we see that in the illustration too. So he knows he can't rush God's timing. And he knows he can't manipulate God's plans. And we see that, don't we? He said, in verse 7 it says, he waits until the rains come. The early rains and the late rains. He waits for them to come. The early rains, they came in October, November. The late rains came in April and March. And then the harvest, if those rains came, the harvest would then come in May and June. And the farmer knows he can't rush those days of rain. He's not in control of that. He can't make it fall. There's nothing he can do. He must wait. He can't change them and he can't rush them. He has to submit to God's sovereign plans. And yet those rains are essential for the harvest. And so he keeps his eye on that day and he patiently waits as he actively works. What if God's day of vindication seems a long way off for you? What if you're waiting in confusion and sorrow? What if his timing is painful? What if the sovereign events in your life, the early and late rains, seem more than you can bear? That can happen. Real pressure. Lord, I can't take this anymore. I can't handle one more season of rain. Well, I can only point you to two other realities of God's sovereign framework that James gives us. So as we said, we have seen the end point, the day of vindication. That's our framework. From now, I am living, I am breathing. That's the day in front of me. What will God bring? And we have seen the sovereign events that mark our path to that day, like the rains that fall. We also need to see two other things. Firstly, God's sovereign purpose. That is present in this framework. And what is his purpose? Well, his purpose is our perfecting, us being made complete, us being conformed to the likeness of Jesus. That's God's purpose. We see that at the very start of James. Just turn back to chapter 1. It's the very first thing that he tells these Christians. Chapter 1, verse 2. Count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of various kinds. There's the testing. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness or endurance. And let endurance have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. That is God's intention through this time period on this framework, that we be conformed by the trials to the likeness of Jesus Christ. Have you got that purpose fixed in your mind and heart? If you do, it will produce patience in you. If you do, it will shrivel up the grumbling spirit that might lash out against others. But not only is there God's sovereign purpose, we see God's sovereign goodness as well in this framework. Verse 11, behold, listen, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast, who endured. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, of the patience of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord. Did you see there was purpose in Job's suffering? God had purpose, and how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. He was compassionate and merciful to Job, and Job saw it. God is good, and we must trust him and wait for his day of vindication, when his goodness will be proved in all its glory. You know, there will not be one Christian in God's eternal glory who will experience one moment or one shadow of regret or bitterness for the path God took them on. All confusion will be wiped away in seeing God's loving purpose and seeing his compassion and his mercy towards us. On that day, we will see things clearly, even if we don't now. But that does not mean it is an easy path now. And we could accuse James potentially of giving us a kind of impersonal example of the farmer. We could say, James, you've just given us a kind of theoretical example. Maybe that's why he goes on and he gives the examples of the prophets and Job. So we see in verse 10 that he gives the prophets as an example. He says, as an example of suffering and patience, brothers and sisters, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. And we know how the prophets suffered, don't we? Each prophet suffered so massively at the hands of God's people. And what was their example to us? Well, they didn't give up. They didn't stop speaking for the Lord, it says in verse 10. They spoke in the name of the Lord all the way to the end. They didn't draw back, just like the farmer. They sowed and they plowed and they waited. And dear brothers and sisters, no matter what you are going through, don't stop serving in whatever capacity you can. Be like the prophets. There is a day of vindication just ahead. It is nearer than you think. And it isn't only a day of vindication, remember. It is a day of abundant blessing for all who are waiting for it. That's what we see in the example of Job in verse 11. Listen, we consider those blessed. There's the language of blessing. Listen, these people that are enduring, that are suffering, they are the blessed ones. They are under covenant, the covenant smile of God. They are blessed who remained steadfast. That's what we're being exhorted to do this morning. To remain steadfast. To endure. You have heard of the endurance of Job. And you have seen the purpose of the Lord. How the Lord is compassionate and merciful. How did Job see God's compassion and mercy and reward in his own life? Well, with greater wealth and flocks and family than he lost. He lost everything and God gave him back more. Of course, remember, God is not into riches. He's condemning the riches of these people here who use them wrongly. But he is giving us a picture in Job and how he was blessed in his lifetime, how the church will be blessed abundantly by God when Jesus Christ returns. So Job's blessing is a picture of the day of precious fruit that the farmer could see and that he was waiting for. And it's a picture of the crown of life that God will give to all who persevere. Look back at chapter 1 and verse 12. Chapter 1 verse 12 of James. Blessed is the person, there's that promise again, that covenant promise of God's abundant goodness poured out. Blessed is the person who remains steadfast, patient, keeps going under trial, under persecution. For when he or she has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life. That's not a literal crown. The crown pictures something else. And in fact, the word in the Greek isn't of a kind of royal crown. It's more of a kind of athlete's wreath. Because it speaks of finishing the race, of enduring to the end and being rewarded for that endurance. And what is the crown of life? Well, the crown of life is life itself. It is eternal life in God. It is the life of God in you, enjoying all the abundance that is the person of God. And we are to show patience in our lives as we wait for that day. And of course, towering over all these examples of patience is Jesus Christ. He fixed his eyes on the joy set before him. And then he endured the cross to arrive at that day. He never once sidestepped the early or late rains that his Father placed in his life. He accepted taking on flesh and being born and growing up in obscurity. He didn't sidestep the reins of having a family that didn't understand him. He didn't sidestep the reins of opposition and persecution that was constantly upon him. Though he had no home, he didn't use his divine power to make himself a home. Though he had satanic opposition and enemies, he didn't call down the legions of angels to deal with them. He walked the path his Father had for him with long suffering. He didn't take a shortcut to glory, like when the devil in the wilderness invited him to take a shortcut to glory. He refused that. And though he did use his divine power to feed 5,000 men and maybe 15,000 people, he did not use that same divine power to feed himself when he was hungry. Jesus didn't sidestep being betrayed. Jesus didn't sidestep being denied by Peter or being forsaken by his disciples. And he didn't sidestep the cross. But in love, he walked towards it and endured it. And his words on the cross were controlled words. He didn't lash out. He said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing. And on that cross, Jesus didn't sidestep the darkest moment on that cross. When the Father, in his sovereign love towards us, put on Jesus our sin, all who will believe in him. And Jesus bore that sin, and he bore the Father's wrath on the cross. Listen to how Donald MacLeod describes that moment on the cross. He says, he was alone. That's Jesus on the cross. He was alone with the world's sin and with God, experiencing the presence of the holy as a dreadful forsakenness. You could meditate on that for a long time. Can you see the paradox? The Father is present, but the Son is forsaken. And Jesus did not sidestep this terrible moment, but he went through it and he endured it. And he did it so that we might also follow him on our path into his glory. I don't know the pain and suffering you are going through, but Jesus does. And he is sufficient for you. And our God calls us not to grumble against one another, but to groan to him. Don't grumble, but do groan to our God. Cry out to our Father in heaven. And maybe that's another reason why Job is given here as an example to us. Because remember, Job did not understand why what was happening to him was happening to him. He was in the dark in that way. He had to trust God. And God showed that Job had the freedom to cry out and to weep before God and to lament before God and to question God and to ask him what is going on. And you can do that. And I can do that. In Psalm 62, David says this, "Trust in God at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for he is our refuge." Do you see the invitation to pour out your heart, to grumble and groan to God in your difficulty, in your confusion? We had a guy preach here, John Cowley, a few months ago, and he gave the picture from this verse of us having to carry a huge bucket of water, as if that's our grief and those are our questions. And he said, you bring it and you pour it out to God. And in doing that, the bucket becomes light. You empty out your pain and your questions on God. He is happy for you to do that. This is the way we journey. This is the way we journey to that day. Well, more quickly, what else will hold us back from grumbling against one another? And it's refusing to be judged. You know, when we grumble, there is an aspect where we make ourselves the judge. When we lash out, we are declaring what we think we know is in other people's hearts when we don't know what is in other people's hearts. And we might strike out with accusations and things like that. And James has strong words for us in verse 9. He says, don't do this. And he says, verse 9, do not grumble against one another, brothers, sisters, so that you may not be judged. Do you see the link between our grumbling and judging? Don't judge unless you too be judged. That's Jesus' words, wasn't it, to us? He said those words, do not judge or you will be judged. For in the same way as you judge others, you will be judged. And with the same measure you use, it will be measured to you. Those are serious words considering the judge is at the door. That's the point, isn't it? Verse 9. He says, listen, the judge is standing at the door. We're to feel his presence. So James here isn't making a statement about timing so much. He's not trying to say this is when Jesus will return. He is saying the one who returns is full of moral purity and burning holiness. And you are to feel that righteousness even now. It's to permeate the church. He is standing at the door. We are going to encounter that righteousness so very soon. So if you imagine a gathering of people and they're waiting for a VIP, for a very important person to turn up, and they're chatting and they're having a good time, and then they hear the person is at the door. Well, there's a ripple through the whole crowd. Yes, the person is at the door. Well, that is to be the church. Every day as we journey towards that final vindication, we're to have a feeling Jesus is at the door. Today could be the day where he steps in and where suddenly I realize I'm not the judge. I'm not the judge. He's the judge. There is only one judge, and he's in the room now. Oh, I wish I hadn't have said that and this. I wish I hadn't have grumbled so quickly and lashed out. And really, that's the point. We are to have control of our tongues. That's one of the main things that James is saying to us. And so in verse 12 it says, but above all. Now when he says above all, that doesn't mean now for the most important thing. He's not saying this is the most important thing. It's more like he's saying here is the big take-home thought from what I've just been saying. Don't swear by either heaven or earth, or by any other oath. In other words, don't try and use your words to manipulate the rains, the early rains and the late rains. Don't think that you're the person that is sovereign and in control. God is sovereign. Don't take it to you to try and manipulate things as we do with our language. Instead, humbly accept the path that God has for you. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. These things are true. These things will help us. And so in verse 8, James says, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. When he says establish your hearts, he means decide now. Decide now that you believe this word of God. Be determined to follow this path. Be determined to follow it, not in your human strength, but by casting yourself completely on Jesus and his grace and his mercy, trusting in God's goodness, trusting in his timeline, trusting in God's sovereignty, trusting in God's purposes, trusting in all those things and saying, I will hold to them no matter what happens. Fix your heart like that. And if you don't know Jesus, if you're sitting here this morning and you do not know Jesus Christ, turn to him now. Turn to him while you have time. He is the returning judge. The day will come when he turns up. It could be today. How are you living? Who are you living for? Are you like those rich people at the start where they are just pursuing their dreams? Life is all about the moment, about the here and now. They haven't got a thought for eternity. Is that you? Is that how you are pursuing your life? Then you are fattening your heart in a day of slaughter. That's the warning. That's the graphic language from James. Don't do that. Instead, you can be ready for that day. That's why Jesus came. You can turn to him. That's why Jesus died on the cross. That all the things that we have done wrong can be placed on him, and God's anger can be poured out on him. And we, in turn, receive his perfect record to stand before a holy God when he comes as judge. Only in the righteousness of Jesus Christ will we be able to stand his holy, perfect gaze. And that is why you should turn to him today. Amen.